Welcome to this roundup on conversations about cinema, impact of conflict, which is the season that's been running for the past 6 months, looking at the impact that wars, conflicts have had and how they've been represented and communicated through film. I'm joined by Professor Tim Cole from Bristol University, who's been one of the chief architects of this partnership, which has not just been Bristol based here at Watershed, but has also been happening with partner cinemas and organisations across the UK. And Tim, the original idea was, it came out of the anniversaries that were coming up, particularly the 70th of the Second World War, and what we wanted to look at was not just what was happening between those dates. Well, not what was happening between those dates, but what the impacts of these of that cataclysmic war was, and we focused on that very much at the beginning with a number of films, particularly Testament of Youth, which was coming out at that time, and then there was films like Au revoir les enfants. But I just wondered, from that starting point, and then we got to the most recent films being Timbuktu and The Look of Silence, and I just wondered what your overall sort of reflections of the whole conversations about cinema has been, and that sort of what's happened over the past 6 months.
Yeah, I was really struck by the way that we moved from something which is much more a set of films around First and Second World War to a set of films about more recent conflicts, turning from, I guess, these kind of big events to a much more, and big events within primarily a European context, to much more the sort of rumblings of violence and conflict at a global level. And in some ways, I think maybe some of the kind of more easily forgotten events. So it felt like we went from a lot of noise in some ways. Something like the First World War Testament of Youth, the 100th anniversary of the First World War. I mean, there was a lot of, it's a sort of big film about a big event, isn't it? To something like Look of Silence, which is much more about, I think, cinema as less kind of reflecting on a big event than actually trying to draw attention to something submerged. I mean, I thought that was interesting, the way that a lot of the films shifted to be almost the cinema and the film director as a kind of unearther of truths about conflict, of kind of finding hidden conflict and laying it bare. And that felt such an interesting journey, I think, across the 6 months.
And that sense of trying to unearth, which and understand, I guess, which both Look of Silence and Timbuktu do in different ways. But I mean, it did seem to be parallel to say Ashes and Diamonds or Rome Open City, in those films of the moment, whereas Testament of Youth is very much a historic. I mean, looking back, really. But there seem parallels with what Sisako and Oppenheimer are doing now, with what Andre Vida and directors like that were doing at the time.
Yeah, and I think there's some really interesting connections, I think, across the season, aren't there? The one I was really struck by was Night Will Fall, Look of Silence, in some ways which are kind of almost films about films, in part, aren't they? The centrality of watching film footage within the film itself, of, in some ways, I think, Cold War context. I mean, those are both films that tell a story about the Cold War and the influence of the Cold War, a kind of much more recent conflict, kind of layers of conflict. So you've got layers of film, layers of conflict. And I think you've got some, real striking similarities. Although, I mean, obviously, those two, I think putting those two in the same season, you get a sense of just the absolute sense of disbelief that what is happening in The Look of Silence, where you've got a couple of perpetrators reenacting the scenes of perpetration in the contemporary era. You just can't even imagine that happening in post-war Germany. And that's these moments where you get a sense of conflict and of dissonance. And so I think that's what's been interesting about the series, is if you put a whole set of films alongside each other, there's these moments where you see some real parallels and a sense in which actually there's some things that, even though movies may be 50 years or 60 or 70 years apart, actually there's some sense in which there's perhaps some common themes or common images around the aftermath of violence and around war and the impact of conflict. But then there's also these kind of jarring differences, which seem, in a sense, probably to be largely around politics, I guess, the kind of political situations that you find yourselves in.
I was thinking about Oppenheimer and Claude, in comparison with Claude Lanzmann and what Claude Lanzmann was doing, has done with Shoah in the Decent One that we screened, which
Last of the Unjust.
Last of the Unjust, sorry, yeah, Last of the Unjust. And, it seemed to me that, is there a different thing that's happening there with Lanzmann and with Oppenheimer, and that what Lanzmann is doing is kind of, in a way, recording, in that tradition of documentary in order to preserve and in order to present, and then the audience will respond in whatever way. Whereas Oppenheimer, there's a sense in which he wants to say this is unjust, and the people's response should be to sort of demand almost that this is addressed. That there was a wrong that was done. I mean, the wrong in the Second World War is sort of self-evident, as it were. Whereas the wrong that Oppenheimer's looking at is, you can tell by the characters, because by the people that are in the film, is that they seem to be not recognising that actually what we did was wrong, which is what makes it sort of horrific to watch. And there's a sort of different approach there to the documentary that's happening.
Yeah, I mean it's an interesting juxtaposition, I think, those two. I guess Lanzmann, he's filming, isn't he, in the 70s, so primarily originally the 70s and then into the 80s. Obviously, Last of the Unjust comes out much later than Shoah, but the stock is done then. You get a sense in those two, Shoah and Last of the Unjust, where the events have happened, and it is primarily about preserving the kind of memory of the events, especially this, the kind of the handful of survivors from somewhere like Helmno, or these kind of these camps that could be lost, and the decaying remnants of those camps that's being, kind of rapidly replaced by grass. That there's a sense in which those films are much more an act of memorial. There's little bits of moments in those films though as well, where you've got a kind of contemporary moral issues, I guess, playing out. In Shoah, most controversially, a lot of that's around Polish anti-Semitism. I guess, and that's one of the really controversial things about Shoah, isn't it? Is that he's in a set of Polish villages interviewing Polish non-Jews, and one of the subcurrents of the film is around the persistence of anti-Semitism, which really gets a lot of controversy raised within the Polish press. Last of the Unjust is interesting, isn't it, where you almost feel like he goes into this former Jewish council member who's been involved in organising the ghetto in Theresienstadt, and he's kind of critical at the beginning, but then almost kind of falls in love with the guy. You feel like he's kind of seduced, and the film in some ways is about being seduced by this character who's morally problematic in some ways. And so there's a sense I think in Last of the Unjust, it feels like there's some complex morality. I mean, I kind of feel like Shoah is a little bit, maybe, it doesn't deal with a kind of grey zone in some ways. I mean, what's interesting about Oppenheimer is in many ways Oppenheimer doesn't do grey zone at all, does he? That it feels like a much more kind of stark right and wrong. It's much more a kind of piece of campaigning cinema. And there's been criticism, I think, of that, hasn't there? That in some ways one of the things Oppenheimer doesn't do is provide a kind of broader sense of context of what's actually happening in this period. I mean, that's kind of not a memorial. This is actually someone who sees
it's a kind
cinema
of activist.
As
it's an activist campaigning
cinema.
And I think some of that's what's interesting about the feedback that we got. Not feedback, but when people were writing responses, there was a couple of academics in Manchester. One who's involved in international human rights. Another one is lecturer at Salford University on media, and that's what they wrote about, was this lack of historical context, pointing out that the son that was killed, that Adi, goes to his brother, goes to sort of track that down, and the killers was an activist, engaged politically. Not that then shapes, I don't, necessarily that changes the moral response, but it doesn't provide a political context, because in a way that would be complex. Whereas what it wants to do is set up this very stark sense of injustice, and there's this idea that documentary is somehow objective in truth, And there's a couple of moments in the film that troubled me in terms of that documentary aesthetic, because you felt the voice of Oppenheimer pushing something in the way that Lanzmann kind of wouldn't do that. And also there's a troubling scene when the father, who can't see, and he's saying I'm lost when he's in one of the rooms, and you think, well, you shouldn't film that. But I subsequently found out that it was Addy that wanted that scene to happen, because what you're then getting is, no, I want people to, if it's a metaphor, I want people to understand and feel engaged. I want this film to engage people in the injustice and the immorality of what happened, and I want them to be angry, and it's a kind of campaigning in a way. It's coming from that, but I think the myth of documentary is objective is a myth,
which you get. I mean, you get in both, don't you? I think you get that in Shoah as well. That in Shoah there's the famous scene with the barber. So this survivor, who's now in Israel, living in Israel. He was a guy who was cutting hair in one of the camps, shearing the hair of the women as they came into the camps before they're gassed. What happens is it's reenacted. That scene is a reenactment in a barbershop. The guy's not a barber, but he creates this kind of tension. And again, he pushes. He says you have to speak in that scene, Lanzmann, which is very much like in The Look of Silence. There is this scene, isn't there, where he's kind of pushing. You have to keep talking about this.
Yeah. You hear Oppenheimer's voice off camera.
You hear Oppenheimer, and he's kind of inserting himself. And I suppose they're interesting, aren't they? Because Oppenheimer is this kind of. He's this. You only hear him, I think, once or twice, don't you? This voice from the background, and he's obviously referred to. In a way, Lanzmann is constantly present, isn't he? He's much more a sort of present. That there's no doubt that this is Lanzmann's film. I mean, I kind of would have liked Oppenheimer in some ways much more to be central within the film, because I think that does undermine that myth of kind of objectivity, doesn't it? If you kind of place yourself as a documentary maker. I mean, it's interesting as a historian, watching those. I guess as historians, I was reflecting a bit about this, so I watch a series of films that we've shown. What's my reflection on my role as a historian vis-a-vis conflict in the past or present, and a filmmakers? And I was really drawn to that sense of, well, the stuff that Oppenheimer does is clearly activist documentary making. It's got a really strong moral agenda and is about enacting change in the present. And I think as historians, we're always a little bit more cautious of that. But I think it does raise some questions. When you're going to think about conflict, it raises a bunch of moral questions. And I kind of wondered, maybe as historians, we shy away from some of those questions in a way that I felt like actually some of the films that we've screened much more kind of, they embrace that. They sort of take that much more, that cinema kind of addresses those issues.
Well, I think it's what's been interesting in that respect is with conversations about cinema is precisely that, getting the academic perspective engaged with the immediacy of these films. Because what these filmmakers are doing is it's about dealing with the work here and now, is it, where we're in the context of what we've been doing, because these are films which are just being released, and bringing together that world of, well, we need to think about this, we need to research it, we need to analyse it, we need to understand it. But for you guys to be actually, right, we're watching it and then we're going to talk about it. So it's that immediacy which I thought was really came alive in terms of so it doesn't become an academic exercise, it becomes a very in the moment engaging with what's on screen.
And I guess it's been an interesting process, isn't it? We've gone for a kind of model of a sort of introduction which often contextualizes, doesn't it? So it kind of brings out some of that broader context, which maybe has been one of the criticisms of, say, Oppenheimer's film, that actually an introduction by academic allows you to just kind of put this one film and this one story
puts it into a box, as it were, or it places it somewhere, whereas actually what Oppenheimer wants is he wants you to engage with this and say,
And I think, that's been interesting, hasn't it, in the Q&A afterwards, is, you see again and again, I think, that actually film it's still a very powerful medium, in a sort of image film saturated context. Actually, there is still a kind of power to sitting with a bunch of people in a cinema and watching a film on the big screen, and then going into the bar and talking about it. The kind of immediate visceral response in some ways, isn't it, often to the kind of scenes that people have seen.
Yeah, and one of the other things I think in comparison or on reflection is that with having the producer of Look of Silence here, is that Look of Silence along with the act of killing, they were 15 years in the making. These are not films that you just go into a country and say, right, I'm going to make a documentary about what's happening here. I mean, the in the same way with Lanzmann, I mean, the research in the work is absolutely faultless. I mean, the 15 years for those two films, and very, very powerful impact. But I want to bring Maiden in, which seems to me to be representative of another kind of cinema that's much more about the kind of, for want of a better term, the YouTube generation. Where here's a film that's shot in the moment in that place, and then is kind of presented there's no context, as it were. It's observational in that sort of classic sense. And we had a remarkable introduction by one of your students, who had Sam, who had gone out there to see what was going on for himself in his own eyes, and then sort of talking about the film. And I thought it was a kind of different kind of documentary, that.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? It's a different kind of documentary. It's a different kind of intro. In some ways, when that film was coming up, we thought, well, who in the university could speak to this? In some ways, we didn't have anyone, because of the kind of, the currency of this. It's such a made in the moment film that it's events that haven't yet, in some ways, entered into history. In terms of my own discipline and department. That we kind of deal with contemporary history, but that was a little bit too contemporary for us in some ways, and it was much more within still a space of kind of current affairs and journalism of something unfolding. And so I thought it was interesting that actually for that kind of almost YouTube generation film, we almost needed a YouTube generation introducer, which was to go skip a generation in a sense, not one of us old academics, but to go for a student, and a student who's kind of, I guess, interested in the immediacy of actually going to a place to try and just kind of get to grips with what's happening now at a place within the world. And so it felt like a YouTube generation introducer to a YouTube generation film, and a very different piece of filmmaking, like you say, to Look of Silence, and about something that's kind of live and is of the moment and is unfolding and is not yet resolved in any way, shape or form. And the film isn't about resolution, is it? It's about kind of reportage.
Well, it's about the liveness, as you say, of the moment, and I think it sort of asks questions of the audience about in a different way, which is, what can we do about this? How can we engage in this world? It's very in a way that if you look back at Rome Open City, if you look back at those films from that era, the Andre Vida's Ashes and Diamonds and things, there's it allows for a period of reflection. It allows for, because you're doing the script, you're developing it, whereas this is very much in the moment. And I think for audiences that can be quite bewildering as well, because what are you supposed to think about this? In the same way that almost you listen to news and you're hearing what's happening in Greece, and you think, well, what can my response be to that? What do I do about it? And so the unfolding of these political moments is kind of right there in cinema through a film like Maidan, clearly. And there's a film coming up later this year, Syria, a love story. Cinema's still right there, dealing with that immediacy and presenting that to audiences.
Which is conflict, not just impact of conflict, isn't it? I mean, in some ways we imagined the series largely as the kind of aftermath of war, didn't we? So the sense of, the ruined city of London, of Rome, as a kind of a new sort of cinemascape, and there's a sense in which cinema is part of this sort of resolution, a part of a kind of looking back. I mean, Testament of Youth is kind of dripping with nostalgia, isn't it, to a sort of lost kind of golden age. It's very much within that sort of tradition. And I think you're right, some of the films that have come right at the end of the series have actually brought, so in a sense it's geographically pushed conflict further away from a largely British or Western European story, which I think has been the dominant kind of thread, in many ways, hasn't it, of the earlier films. And it's taken it global, but I think it has also brought it to a sense of actually that conflict is still very much with us, and that unresolved conflict is more troubling, isn't it? Because I think Testament of Youth is not a film that in any way troubles you largely. I mean, it's a film that there's a kind of safety, isn't there, of 100 years. Whereas I think you're right that some of the more recent films that we've shown are actually about conflict still ever present, and that it's distant, but it's distant spatially, but it's present chronologically, and that's kind of troubling.
But I think what was interesting about Testament of Youth is that it was probably the one film that had the biggest emotional impact. In the remember at the time there was intergenerational audiences watching it, and there was a real sort of it unlocked something in the emotions and the memory of people that connected generationally, so that there was younger people who were saying, God, my mother was, it kind of got that response, which I thought was really interesting.
Because it's got such a strong sense of loss, isn't there, in there, which I think is very kind of touching, moving. But it's, I mean, it feels like, it's interesting, I don't know if the people made the kind of connections. It feels like it's a connections around a set of generational issues. So it's kind of a grandparents or great-grandparents generation, whereas some of the films that are much more in the contemporary or in the present, it feels like that has maybe triggered more connections with the kind of stuff that's going on in people's lives in the here and now. I think that's one thing we were interested in, wasn't it? Is what kinds of connections do cinema audiences make? So do they see these films as kind of historical pieces over and finished, or do they see them as having this kind of contemporary resonance? And I think certainly there's been a strong sense, isn't there, from the feedback, the kind of stuff that people have been writing or tweeting about, that actually a lot of these films, there's still some real contemporary relevance and resonance to them.
And I think that was picked up in some of the partners in Chapter in Cardiff and QFT in Belfast, which was they also sort of took up the specificities of their place and ran with that, and so obviously the Troubles and films like 71 that are dealing with that, but also some documentary filmmakers and some work that were coming out of that contemporary context in Northern Ireland, and then reflections in Wales as well around the sort of mining community. And I thought that was what was really interesting in relationship to the overarching theme, was that places dealing with their in a way that when we had 12 Years a Slave, not as part of the season, but there was some very specific Bristol issues that unlocked. So and a lot of that work is indeed been captured on the website through whether the Twitter conversations or indeed sort of individual writings. What do these contemporary films in the first couple of decades, what do they say about the 21st century?
Yeah, I mean, that idea of the 20th century being the American century, I think I've been kind of conscious of that all the way through. I mean, so Night Will Fall, one of the greatest reasons why that film, the original film, is not made, is because of American influence and American importance, and around the rise of the Cold War and the way in which during the Cold War, West Germany has to be rehabilitated. The kind of old Allies, Soviet Union has to be, kind of chased around. The Holocaust is the wrong story, in the early in the kind of late 1940s, early 1950s, because of the Cold War. And you get the sense in which the American century continues. The Cold War is so important to the Look of Silence, isn't it? Which is around anti-communist rhetoric. It's the American influence right the way into the East, where that's absolutely the dominance of the United States is central in many ways to the Look of Silence. It's kind of one of the backstories that's very much present, I think, is there. And so one of the things that I have been really struck by is the way that the Cold War is this kind of odd conflict, isn't it? Which is a sort of backstage conflict that is rarely enacted, that kind of bursts out at little moments into acts of violence, but tends to be this kind of a cold rather than hot war that stays in the background, and yet has had a huge influence, and that a number of the films have really picked up on that. I suppose one of the things about it post-Cold War era is that also the end of this kind of American dominance, that emerges post-First World War, really kind of is strengthened, I think, in the 1950s and 60s and the 70s, but then is replaced with a more kind of complex set of geopolitical situations. And I think some of the more recent films have been about that, haven't they? That there's a much more complex geopolitics to the world in the 21st century, that it's not a simple set of kind of power blocks. Sort of the binaries of the Cold War are replaced with a much more complex and in many ways much more troubling set of different power plays that are much more regional and dispersed. And some of the more recent films that we've been showing have kind of picked up on that, haven't they? And I think some of the stuff, if talking about Syria, that's going to be coming up in the future, that suddenly there's a different set of power blocks on there at play there.
Well, I think that's where Timbuktu becomes, for me, one of the key films. And I think it will be recognised as a very significant film because it's addressing what is happening in Africa. It's addressing, what's happening within ideas of Islam and extremism, and what that means for culture and identity, and the values that are at stake there. And again, in the West, we're reading about this, but here's a film which actually takes you there. And but it's not simple. It does address it as again, not black and white. That's quite it's nuanced and it's not clear cut. And I mean, just from a film point of view, that what's been really strong about the film is that it's got an audience. It's had an audience, and African cinema in the UK is woefully underrepresented. Less than 1% of films that are screened in cinemas are from Africa. It's actually much less than 1%. And here's this African film that comes out. It's got something very urgent, to say. It's very thoughtful, and it looks as though it will probably be one of the highest grossing foreign language films released in the UK. So audiences want to see this as well, and it's telling them a story that's very current, very immediate, about very troubling political and cultural sort of conflict that's going on. So it's very, I think that's, for me, is just been quite extraordinary to see that.
I mean, the whole series has been interesting, hasn't it, in audience response, that there is an audience for cinema that deals with difficult issues and troubling times. I mean, that's been really striking, hasn't it?
I think we did this sensing that audiences want to get underneath, they want to get into the complexity, they want to engage with it. And I think the 6 months has demonstrated that's definitely the case.
Absolutely, yeah.
So the conversations about cinema, all of the contributions and more have been captured on the Conversations About Cinema website, and as we speak, we have got plans to develop and keep the Conversations About Cinema going over the next few months, not necessarily on the same theme, the impact of conflict, but watch this space. Thank you very much, Tim.